Hey guys, Todd Anderson here with another Magic Online video for your entertainment purposes. Today we're going to be playing a bit with the blue-red control slash goggles slash whatever you want to call it deck that I've been playing a lot over the last few weeks as we sort of delve into Shadows over Innistrad Standard. The deck is, I want to say, mildly complicated. There are a lot of interesting decisions you have to make throughout a lot of the games, and even some of the more minor mistakes, early on could lead to things kind of spiraling out of control. Every decision you make in the early turns of the game usually matters on how the later turns end up kind of working themselves out. The backbone of the deck, as you may already know, is going to be Pyromancer's Goggles. We got that over here on the right above me part of the screen. Yeah, for some reason Windows 10 the card image thing just kind of borked when I updated, and I have no idea how to fix it. So goggles, it's not going to change every time we click on a new card. But heart of the deck, Pyromancer's Goggles. It is the reason to play the deck, in my opinion. It does a lot of really interesting things. With Tormenting Voice or Magmatic Insight, it allows you to discard a card and draw 4. Since it is making a copy that puts it on the stack, you actually don't have to discard the second time, which is pretty sweet. Alongside Pyromancer's Goggles, we have a slew of removal spells here with 4 copies of Lightning Axe, 3 copies of Fiery Impulse, and 4 copies of Fiery Temper, which you can pay the madness cost off of Pyromancer's Goggles, which is kind of cool, and fork it. But the big one that is kind of strange that a lot of people, I guess, aren't really leaning towards, I guess, is Fall of the Titans. And people have asked me all sorts of stuff about this card, like, why aren't you playing Absence Judgment? Why don't you just play Burn from Within? And the reason is because Fall of the Titans is actually just a pretty good card. We in the previous standard format, it was not there too long before we moved into this new Shadows over Innistrad format with a big rotation and whatnot. And it looks like a very good card in Limited and not a great constructed card. And for the most part, I would agree with you. But with Pyromancer's Goggles, you get to do some insane stuff. You get to usually kill 2 creatures and deal your opponent somewhere between like 8 and 20 damage, just depending on how much mana you have lying around, how much your initial card cost before you got to Surge the Fall of the Titans, things like that. Now, in the grand scheme of things, if you're just trying to fireball your opponent, Burn from Within is better. But earlier in the game, like let's say turn 5 or 6, sometimes you need to play a cheap 1-mana removal spell or a cheap card draw spell followed by a card that can kill 2 creatures. And that's very important when the format is full of things like Collect a Company, aggressive white weenie decks, and just a lot of creatures in general. Fall of the Titans can pick off 2 things at once. It can also just be a fireball, and that's why I like it with Pyromancer's Goggles. So now that we have that out the way, Fall of the Titans I think is better than Absence Judgment for a number of reasons. The deck actually doesn't have that many ways to use Madness. Basically, we just have 4 copies of Lightning Axe, 4 copies of Tormenting Voice, and 4 Jace Vryn's Prodigy. Now, all of these require a little more setup than Fall of the Titans if you're trying to combine it with Absence Judgment. The thing about Absence Judgment is that the front half needs to be great. The fire, I guess, of fire and ice, just deal 2 damage, split however you like, basically 2-mana forked bolt, if you will, needs to be very good if you want to play that card over the Fall of Titans. And right now, I don't think that the front half is particularly good. The second thing about Absence Judgment, when you're trying to fork it off of Pyromancer's Goggles, it actually is kind of weird, and I don't actually even really know how it works, but I know that it's kind of wonky. Let's say you have Absence Judgment and you madness it and you just treat it like a Rolling Thunder, and then you copy it. You can change the targets for it, but you have to choose at least the same number of targets. I think you have to choose exactly the same number of targets with it. But then you can kind of spread the damage around. But you have to deal at least 1 damage to each thing that you initially targeted. So if you want to fork an Absence Judgment and one of your targets is going to be a 1 toughness creature, you're kind of losing a damage in the process, if that makes sense. Yeah, so it's a little wonky. A lot of people have suggested it, and I don't think it is bad, but I do think that it is just slightly worse than Fall of the Titans because it requires a little more setup. casting any spell is a lot better than having to find a discard outlet, and especially so if you're using something like Tormenting Voice off of Pyromancer's Goggles early to try to like actually dig into more stuff. At that point, you may be stuck with just Absent Judgment in hand and no way to actually get it with Madness. And in those spots, it's going to be a lot worse than Fall of the Titans. As for the rest of the deck, I would say that the blue actually makes the deck come together. The 4 copies of Jace and Thing in the Ice are the only cards main deck that require blue mana other than, I guess, Wandering Fumarole. But they also just don't require you to invest that much into them to threaten something massive. A flipped Jace early on can threaten a removal spell. You could even take it up to the point where you could threaten to ultimate and start milling them out, which is a definite possibility in this deck. We have a number of engine type cards with Chandra Flamecaller and Pyromancer's Goggles, so that we actually, once we get to the point where we have a Jace emblem, it will not take very long to deck your opponent, like maybe 2 turns. And if the spells you're actually casting to mill them are removal spells, it's going to be very difficult for your opponent to actually, kill you before that actually happens. One thing to note, the copy off of Pyromancer's Goggles does not trigger Thing in the Ice. It does not trigger off of Jace's ultimate. The copies themselves are completely independent of things that say cast a spell. That's why you don't have to pay the additional cost for Magmatic Insight or Tormenting Voice or even Lightning Axe. You just got to discard the 1 card, but the downside is does not trigger Thing in the Ice multiple times. Cat. Yeah, so the 2 engine cards in the deck, Chandra Flamecaller and Pyromancer's Goggles. Chandra is just a Swiss Army knife in the deck, and for the longest time I had 2 copies main, 1 copy sideboard, and yeah, I did board it in a lot, and I think a lot of that was because I felt like a lot of matchups you kind of needed the 3rd Chandra either as a sweeper effect, or if your opponent had some discard spells like Transgress the Mind or Duress, you just needed more overall copies of your big engine cards. And I didn't want to get too gummed up with stuff like Chandra in my main deck. My deck is very fluid. You have a lot of cards that kind of chain off of each other. You spin the wheels a good number of turns in the early game, but you need something to capitalize once you start spinning those wheels. That's why Thing in the Ice is so good. You spend 2 mana for this thing, and then every time you cast a Tormenting Voice for like no value, for example, or you cast a Magmatic Insight for no value, you need that to actually sort of push you towards something. And both Jace Vryn's Prodigy and Thing in the Ice help a lot with that. And if you have too many expensive spells in your deck, the engine kind of starts to break down over time. You do want to draw Chandra early, and playing 3 does help that because if you're bringing back a Drawn Yard Temple, like if you're taking a whole turn off to cast I guess a Rampant Growth, you want there to be some sort of payoff. And with only 5 cards, I was finding that the Drawn Yard Temples were a little worse than I wanted them to be, which is why we just added the 3rd Chandra to the main deck. So we're going to play with that today and see how much I like it. I may, at the end of the video, go back and recommend just going back down to 2, maybe putting the Chandra back into the sideboard and making a small change to the sideboard. But yeah, that's the main deck. The mana is pretty simple. We have 1 copy of Yavimaya Coast and 4 copies of Drawn Yard Temple and 4 Shivan Reef to help trigger Eldrazi Obligator out of the sideboard. Now, I know I've talked a bit about Eldrazi Obligator and basically just trying to ignore ramp, and the more I play against ramp, the more I found that the matchup is not nearly as bad as I thought. And I just need like 1 thing or 2 things to really carry me over the finish line. And if I can draw enough burn spells or enough ways to just actually deal my opponent damage, I can usually close them out of the game before I lose to, an Ulamog attacking for the 2nd time. The thing that helps that the most in this format, I think, is going to be a threaten effect. They don't have a lot of creatures early. They could play Sylvan Advocate. They could play Thought Nazi or something like that. But for the most part, they may have Sylvan Advocate in their main deck, but after they see all these Fiery Tempers, these Fiery Impulses, Lightning Axes, and such, they're probably just going to cut them. And especially when you're like bricking them early with Thing in the Ice, it's pretty rare that you're going to see Sylvan Advocate after sideboard against you, since you do have this high density of removal spells, and you don't really have room necessarily to board them all out. Now, the joke's on them. We actually do have enough room to board them all out, because our sideboard playing against them is going to involve 12 cards. 4 copies of Negate, 4 copies of Fever Visions, and 4 copies of Eldrazi Obligator. Now, Negate is going to do this weird thing where it may not end up being great at the points where you need it to be great, but it can slow them down a little bit in the early game. It can stop them from resolving, their Hedron Archive, for example, or their Explosive Vegetation on the turn where you need to buy yourself just a little bit of time. And I did have a couple copies of Void Shatter in my deck at some point, and they were a little bit better at helping fend off things like Dragon Lord Tarka or World Breaker or even Ulamog. But the thing is, they're going to find another one. They have a lot of copies of Sanctum of Ugin, and they're going to be able to pop those pretty regularly because we don't put a ton of pressure on them in the early game. So Negate, I think, is good just for slowing them down enough so that you can try to get something big on the board, whether it's flipping a Thing in the Ice, whether it's putting a Chandra into play, or Pyromancer's Goggles. One of those cards early enough alongside a Negate should be enough to leverage the 1 or 2 turn window you have before these cards start getting hammered by things like World Breaker, or if they cast Ulamog, they can actually just take care of Chandra. Or sometimes if they just have their own Chandra, they can kill your Chandra. So you got to be kind of careful with that, and you got to pick your spots and choose your battles wisely. Aside from that, Eldrazi Obligator, 3 mana, 3/1 haste, which is already a pretty good rate on its own, but you have the option to steal a Dragon Lord Tarka and hit him for 11, steal a Ulamog and hit him for 13, steal a War Breaker and hit him for 8. It's just great. You can play it early and just start hitting them for 3, and a lot of times you're going to kill them with just like your last Fire Temper or your last Fall of the Titans, or you're going to flip your Jace and hit them for the last couple points of damage with one of those spells. And Eldrazi Obligator just goes a long way in helping make sure that you have a few more draws in the late game that you can actually hit off of, let's say, a Magmatic Insight or a Tormenting Voice that can actually just close the door on them. Fevered Visions comes in that matchup as well, because they have so many dead cards in their deck, and it's not like you can actually deal with their World Breaker or deal with their Ulamog anyway, that the extra cards don't really matter that much, and the 2 damage a turn actually helps a lot. Think of this card way more like a Sulfuric Vortex against them, where it's just a 3 mana spell that's just going to end up dealing them around 6 points of damage, maybe more. And if it is more, then that's fantastic. And if it's less, then maybe it doesn't end up being good enough. If they already have a World Breaker or an Ulamog or a Dragon Lord Tarka in play, it's not going to do all that much. But if you cast it on, let's say, turn 3 after negating their Nissus Pilgrimage, then it's going to go a long way in making sure that it deals them a reasonable amount of damage, so that, your Flip Thing in the Ice, your Fiery Tempers, your Fall of the Titans with Pyromancer's Goggles, or even just a Chandra +1 is actually going to be able to take them down. When you combine this card with Eldrazi Obligator, sometimes you get a lot of spots where you can afford to take a hit from an Ulamog or afford to take a hit from a Dragon Lord Tarka and still be able to kill them. So yeah, that's about it for that. As for the 2 Dispels and the Running Volley, these cards come in combination with other sideboard cards in a number of matchups. For example, Dispel, Negate both come in against your various Esper decks, your control decks. Dispel, not Negate, comes in against things with Dromoka's Command and Collect a Company, like Band Collect a Company. Running Volley can come in against any deck with Avacyn, but is serviceable in the mirror for making sure that like Jace and Thing in the Ice don't get to transform. And Fever Visions alongside Negate and possibly Dispel is a weird little package that you can bring in against a lot of the Black X mid-range decks, and where you get to side out all of your creatures. They generally have to respect your Thing in the Ice and your Jace, and if they do that, they're going to have a bunch of dead removal spells in their hand. So things like Fever Visions don't actually gain them resources. They just kind of flood out with extra cards in hand, and ultimately just end up falling to the damage from that, combined with Fiery Tempers or Fall of the Titans. Fear Visions is one of my favorite sideboard plans I've had in a long time in any deck, and it's been much better than I initially thought it would be. And over time, I don't think the deck would be even good without it. If you have to rely too much on Thing in the Ice or Jace against a deck with 15 removal spells, you're just not going to be able to win the game with those cards. And Fever Visions just gives you an enchantment as opposed to a creature, which is significantly harder to interact with, and deals them a bit of damage in the process. The cool thing about Fever Visions, too, is that if your opponent plays something like a Gideon or an Omnixilus or a Chandra, the damage from Fear Visions can actually be redirected to their Planeswalker at the end of turn. It's kind of awkward if they +1 their Gideon because he does have a damage prevention clause. But against all the other Planeswalkers, you can deal 2 to it, and then you usually get to untap and kill it with a Fiery Temper or a Wandering Ephemeral or something like that. Yeah, I think that's about it. Anyway, let's go ahead and get into the matches with the deck. We're just going to be playing a 5-round competitive league on Magic Online. Excuse me. This new competitive offering on Magic Online, I think, is pretty great. So if you haven't checked those out, make sure you do. Basically, you break even with a 3-2. You don't get anything for a 2-3 or worse. And if you go 4-1, you get 6 packs, and 5-0, I believe you get 10 packs, maybe 11. I haven't 5-0'd yet. I've only played 2. Anyway, guys, we're going to go ahead and jump into a match. We'll be back in just a second.